Hi, I'm Stephen Ash. I'm a practicing nephrologist with Indiana University Health Arnett in Lafayette, Indiana. And I've also been involved in many of the new projects and devices in dialysis over the years. It's my pleasure today to interview Christopher Blagg, who was a vital and pivotal force in the early implementation of hemodialysis, both for acute renal failure and, of course, chronic renal failure and the whole establishment and concept of home dialysis. This interview is part of the Project Bionics Pioneer series in artificial organs. So Chris is certainly a pioneer in this particular field. His education started at King James Grammar School and finished with at the University of Leeds School of Medicine with a MD CHB degree. That was in 1954. He then was a house physician, resident and fellow in Leeds Hospital, and had a short stay in the United States as an international research fellow at the University of Washington. He then returned to Leeds, but eventually returned to Seattle as an assistant professor, finally professor of medicine and emeritus professor at the University of Washington School of Medicine, Seattle. Also served in the military from 56 to 58 and in the reserves after that, and has published over 300 peer-reviewed articles, a number of textbook chapters, at least 15, and has given innumerable presentations on the field of dialysis. He's a stalwart member and contributor of ASIO, an ex-president, also one of the original founders of the International Society for Hemodialysis. So it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Blagg. So let me ask, what made you decide to be a physician in the first place?
About the age of 12 or 13, I got to know the local doctor in our small town, who was a very nice man, and I was so impressed by him. I mean, I only went to him, I forgot what it was for now, but it was something very trivial. But he was so nice, and he used to see me occasionally and stop and talk and so on. And I thought, that sounds interesting. So that was it from about the age of 13 onwards.
Yeah. And you were living in Yorkshire then, in a small town?
In a small town, well, a somewhat bigger town than we later moved in. I suppose it was a suburb, really, of Leeds, big city.
And that experience led you to finishing your medical degree, and then, of course, you served as a house physician in Leeds Hospital, as well as Brompton Hospital. What sparked your interest in nephrology? I guess there wasn't nephrology in those days, yeah. But there certainly was the early stages of dialysis.
I don't think it was sparked, it was pushed on me, because when I came out of the army, I was interested in thyroid disease, and I got a research fellowship in thyroid disease and ran the radioisotope clinic, iodine clinic, in the Leeds General Infirmary. And they'd had the first dialysis unit in Britain since immediately after the Second World War. Started in 1956 and was run jointly by a urologist and a member of the Department of Medicine. Well, about 2 weeks before I went back to Leeds, the internist, who was the Department of Medicine's representative, his child was killed, and the professor thought that as his wife was American, he should go back to America for a year to help her to get over it. And I was the bottom of the totem pole, so I was told to go and help Frank Parsons with the artificial kidney. And it was help because we didn't have a technician for the first year that I was there.
Wow.
It was, and we served the whole of Northern England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. And most of the patients came by train. There weren't helicopters and things like that in those days.
And they were mostly acute dialysis?
They were all acute. I mean, I think as a lot of people did, if somebody didn't recover renal function within 2 or 3 weeks, we biopsied them, and if they had chronic renal failure, we said nice things to them and sent them home to die.
And the equipment you were using at that time?
Was a Kolff Brigham artificial kidney, which is the rotating drum that Kolff developed and which was manufactured, slightly modified in Boston by John Merrill and Ed Olson. So that was our usual machine.
How many did you have?
Oh, we only had one machine.
Just had one?
One machine. I mean, we on occasion, at least one occasion, we worked for 36 hours because the people came, patients came in. It was very interesting.
Yeah. And as it was a rotating drum, you had to thread the cellophane on from the roll?
We put the cellophane first on a little piece of equipment and put it in the sterilizer. And then, yes, we wound the drum. We measured out the chemicals and put them in the tank. And then one of us would sit at the end of the drum while we were dialyzing, because if you're not careful, you can get blood to accumulate in the bottom of the drum. And so you had to keep it the rotation just right. So
wow. And access in those days?
Access cut down on an artery and a vein. And either Frank did it because he was a surgeon, or we would have one of the regular surgeons come and do it for us.
To cut down and then tie a catheter in and leave it for a few days, probably? Or?
No, we took it out at the end of dialysis.
And put another one in.
Put another one in.
Pretty laborious surgery, actually. Yeah. So you went then from military back to Leeds, and then you had this opportunity for an international research fellowship in Washington. So by that time, you'd done about how many dialyses?
Well, I've no idea, but we've been doing dialysis for 5 years.
Yeah. Right.
So there were several hundred patients. I'm sorry, I had another thought and I forgot what it was now.
You had already used a Scribner type shunt as well?
Yes, we used to get the minutes of the meetings of the American Society of Artificial Internal Organs. Scrib talked about the shunt in April 1960. We got the thing by mail in Britain about August or September, and we rode off to Seattle and got some Teflon tubing and the mandrel that you wound it round and all that sort of thing. And in early 1961 we treated 2 chronic patients, one of whom died after about a month and the other of whom lived for somewhere between 3 and 4 months. And as I said earlier, he died with more calcium than I think I've ever seen before or since in a patient. But because we were a big, active, acute program, we decided we just couldn't do chronic dialysis because it interfered with the...
And so what did you find different in Seattle?
Well, it was the Division of Nephrology was really devoted to dialysis. Dr. Scribner was a wonderful person, and we had fellows. I was one fellow from Britain. There was a fellow from France, a fellow from Switzerland. It was an international mixture, together with some Americans, obviously. And I was fortunate because having done all this dialysis, I used to relieve Scrib doing rounds and things like that with the fellows. And I was planning to do, we had done animal studies in England on using anabolic steroids on rabbits. We've done some studies on nephrectomized rabbits. And I wanted to do that in Seattle, but the medical director of the Seattle Artificial Kidney Unit didn't care for the university fiddling with his patients, so I never really got to do that. So what I did was play around with hypertensive rats for a year, which was interesting because I'd done some rabbit experimental work, but I'd never worked with rats before. But I've never worked with them since either.
And they were establishing at that time some kind of a chronic program?
Oh, they had it already.
Yeah, right.
See, Scripps started 4 patients during 1960, one of whom died after about a year, the oldest one of the 4. And he wanted to treat more patients. And the hospital wouldn't permit it because they said there wasn't enough space to treat it more than he was treating already. So, because there was also an acute program there, they had a big acute program for the whole state of Washington at that time. So in 1961, he approached a doctor called Jim Haviland, who had been associate dean at the University of Washington. In fact, was probably the stimulus behind the development of the medical school at the University of Washington. And Jim was the president of the King County, the local medical society. And so Jim knew what was going on with Scripp, and so Scripp persuaded the King County Medical Society that we should have an outside of the hospital freestanding dialysis unit. The other thing about it was the experience gained in dialyzing in the hospital shown that you didn't need to have a doctor there. I mean, before that, they always had a doctor, almost on the spot for dialysis. So, the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center was established in 1961. All the arrangements for it, and opened in January 1962 as the world's first out-of-hospital dialysis unit. And the big problem was, how do you pay for patients? And the John A. Hartford Foundation gave which is AMP Foods, gave a grant to the Seattle Artificial Kidney Center, 3-year grant. And so the question was, who do you treat? Because the estimate, based on what the local insurance people and so on said, was there were somewhere between 50 and 200 patients in the state of Washington who had chronic renal failure each year. And they had initially 3 beds to do dialysis in, which meant they could treat 9 patients because they were dialyzing patients twice a week overnight. So something had to be done. So what happened was they first established a medical advisory committee who decided what the criteria were going to be. Basically, it was between the ages of 18 and 40, and later 45, and with chronic renal failure, but with no complications except controlled hypertension. And they had to be a resident of the state of Washington. And all the patients who the medical advisory committee believed were suitable candidates for treatment were then reviewed by an admissions committee, which was the infamous 7-member committee that the Life magazine article in 1962 showed in silhouette. And there were 2 physicians on it, neither of whom was a nephrologist, and 5 other people, including a housewife, a banker, a man from the insurance agency, and I forget. And a reverend gentleman who became the second chairman. Anyway, they never met the patient except on one occasion. They took all the information they could get. Their patients were reviewed by a psychiatrist or by a psychologist if it seemed appropriate, and they made this difficult decision about who's to be treated. So that by 1964, there were actually 12 patients being treated. Of course, this became notorious in this committee. It was called the Life or Death Committee in the Life article, but since then it's got if you like, changed to life and death committee or death committee and so on. And George Schreiner, for example, said, we'd never do anything like that in Georgetown. It's up to the physicians to make the decision. Well, the concern in Seattle was, what's the poor guy who's the medical director of the kidney center going to do? How's he going to decide? When Senator Jackson calls him and tells him, I've got this friend who you need to treat, I mean, it was an impossible situation.
Yeah.
So it just gradually grew from that.
And when did the idea come to you that patients could do this at home?
Well, it didn't come originally to me. The first person to do it was at the Brigham in Boston. Eugene Shupak, who was one of Merrill's fellows, used to travel into work with a patient who was a neighbor of his, I believe, and he thought about it and decided that the patient and his wife were quite capable of doing dialysis themselves. So he told John Merrill about this idea, and so one Saturday morning the division sat down to discuss this, and I think numbers may not be absolutely correct, but there were about 11 people there and Dr. Merrill. And Gene Shupak proposed what he wanted to do and talked about it in questions and so on. And so they had a vote. And the vote was 10 people against it, 1 for it, Gene Shupak. Whereupon Merrill said something to the effect of, well, of course, I'm the head of this division, so that gives me 12 votes, so we'll do it. And they treated this first patient in January '64. Seattle, it was a bit different. There was she was 15 at that time, 15-year-old girl with chronic renal failure due to systemic lupus. Well, she was underage, she was not the right age to be treated, she had a complicated disease, and so she was turned down by the committee. And at this point in time, the University of Washington was using a proportioning system for the 4 stations that were in the dialysis room that had been developed by Dr. Babb and his team. He was the professor of nuclear engineering at the University of Washington. And so sometime, I guess probably about April of the year, Dr. Scribner called Dr. Babb one morning and said, I need your help, and explained what the problem was, and said, can you make a single patient machine? And he said yes, and they had that by June, and the patient, Carolyn Helm, started dialysis in June, went home in July, and so that was the second program. The other program that did home dialysis was in London, Stanley Shalden's program, and Stanley had been running a program where patients could come in the evening and basically dialyze themselves with a nurse running around there. And so when Stanley heard about this, he started to do home dialysis. What Stanley did, though, he was the first person to do overnight home dialysis, and came and told Seattle about it at a meeting that Eli was there at too in 1964. And so by probably the spring of '65, all patients were changing over to home dialysis, and many of them overnight.
3 nights a week or 4?
3 nights a week.
Mm-hmm.
That became, by that time, the standard in-center or at home was 6 hours 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. But if you did it at home and you did it overnight, you could dialyze as long as you wanted.
And the equipment by that time, the dialyzer was...
the dialyzer was the Keel dialyzer.
So the patients had to assemble it every treatment?
No, because we learned to reuse it. So the patients could dialyze for 2 weeks, and then they had to change the cellophane and everything else.
And how did they sterilize it?
Filled it with, with formaldehyde, and then rinsed it out before they did the dialysis. The advantage of the Keel was that it had a small blood volume. The coil had a much bigger requirement in terms of blood volume.
And again, the access for the first home patients shunt?
Was the Scribner shunt, which Scribner, Dr. Dillard, who was a cardiac surgeon, and Wayne Quinton, who was the hospital engineer at that time, devised. And it came about in a strange sort of way. Dr. Scribner had talked at the doctor's dining room about how he wanted to treat these patients. And so a different cardiac surgeon said to Scrib, you should go and talk to Wayne Quinton in the engineering lab because he has this Teflon tubing. And we, the cardiac surgeons, said we use it to wrap round pacemaker wires, and we use it for the, if you like, the monitoring of post-heart surgery for first day or two, because blood doesn't clot in it. And so he went there and they told Wayne what they wanted, and 2 weeks later Wayne showed them what they wanted, and on May the 6th, 1960, they put it into Clyde Shields, and it worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it still works in some places.
Yeah.
Yes. And what, back in those earlier days, what was your feeling and impression of dialysis? Were the patients much healthier after the dialysis was implemented?
Yeah, I mean, well, we're talking about the chronic patients.
Yeah,
right?
the chronic, yeah.
Yeah, the chronic patient, yes, because we were dialyzing them 6 or more hours 3 times a week. Mm-hmm. And when they went home, they could do more if they wanted. Mm-hmm. We didn't increase the frequency. We stayed at 3 times a week.
Yeah, right. There must have been at least a feeling of you weren't sure how long this was going to go with any one patient or what the outcome was going to be.
No, I think by the time the kidney, very early on from starting the kidney centre, it became obvious that the only deaths that occurred was one of the university patients about a year out, and he was a 45-year-old man who I think had angina. He wouldn't have gotten the kidney centre program. And then the next death was the patient I mentioned to you earlier, who came from Koff's unit and who died in 1966. And he was the first death in the kidney centre. Remember, these were all very selected patients.
Yeah.
So I mean, it was exciting rather than worrying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it must be. Did you find it amazing that a simple collection of cellophane and salt water could remove the uremic toxins well enough to wake someone up from uremic coma or improve their health?
Not really, because I was catapulted right into it, and with the acute patients. So I was used to it. I mean, for example, one thing that we didn't really know about in 1958 was that was the time when we began to learn about the problems of patients with high blood ureas who then developed cerebral symptoms when you quickly dialyze them. There were lots of things like that we just found out because they just happened.
Mm-hmm. You were pretty instrumental in expanding that home program in Seattle, right?
Well, not initially, but yes, when I came. In the Seattle program, we only had 12 patients on home dialysis. We had another grant from John A. Hartford, and the kidney centre had a small number of patients. And around about 1965-66, as the kidney centre was slowly growing, Scrib talked about home dialysis and why it was better and so on. And so the kidney centre started its own program. And it grew and grew and grew. I think the maximum number of patients it had must have been, I think, about 1980, with 300 patients on home hemodialysis.
Really?
So.
Wow. What do you think have been the biggest improvements of dialysis since those days?
Good question. I can tell you some things that are bad, but well, obviously there are newer machines. I mean, there are the disposable dialyzers, the hollow fiber dialyzers, and the other disposable dialyzers. In terms of the machines, they've not changed all that much. I think the best machine was the ill-fated Axis machine, which we were the first people to use in about 1998, 99, and which was based on 1990s technology, but for a home patient it was ideal. I used to tell the patient, when you come home, you switch the machine on, and then you either go and have a beer or a coffee for 20-25 minutes while the machine warms up. You then connect yourself to the machine, do the dialysis. At the end of dialysis, you unplug yourself from the machine, stick 2 bottles of chemicals into the machine, pull a switch and leave it, and the machine cleans itself, makes the dialysate and so on, and you don't need to touch it again until you come home for the next dialysis. But of course the company went bankrupt because it was badly run from a business point of view.
Yes, that was unfortunate. You were pretty central in that whole machine effort, right?
Well, because I knew Carl Shellstrand, who was the medical director of the company. And yeah, we were the first people to do it for the FDA studies. And the interesting change to my mind is that when we did the studies for the FDA, we took the patient and trained them in the centre for 3 or 4 weeks. And once they were trained, we sent them home. Well, the FDA since then has come to the belief that there's something different about dialysis in the home. So that now, if you have a new machine, you have to use it in the centre for quite a period of time to show that it's safe, and then you're allowed to do another study at home to show that it works in the home. So that's a big change that's occurred with time.
Right. It's certainly counter to general experience. I think the overall safety record for patients on home dialysis is at least as good as in center.
Oh, yes.
Right. So that was the Access machine.
That was the Access machine.
Yeah.
And then the next stage machine came along, which, I mean, is an interesting machine. I have to say that several of our patients who had been on the Access machine and had to transfer went into mourning because they didn't think it was as good as the Access machine. But on the other hand, it served its purpose very well.
It's certainly it's a simpler machine.
Yes, that's right.
Do you think that innovation in nephrology, like those 2 machines, is pretty slow?
I think it has been slow.
Yeah.
But of course, I mean, you've got to know that you're going to have a fairly big audience if you're going to make a new machine. I mean, you can't just do it and then everybody's going to grab it. And I think that in the US, part of the problem has been the Medicare program. And, to go back in history, I mean, in 1966, Gus Hampers and Ted Hager in Merrill's group, when, like Seattle, the hospital would not allow them to be doing more dialysis because they had this transplant program that took everything. They established what I believe was the second out-of-hospital dialysis unit in Normandy House, which was an extended care facility in Boston. And it was very successful. And in 1968, when they wanted to expand, business people got involved, and a for-profit company, National Medicare, was founded. And by the time that Medicare came in 1973, I think NMC had about 15 different units scattered in several major cities in the US. And it's gradually become so profit-orientated. I mean, not just Fresenius and National Medical Care, but much of the system has become so profit-orientated that most patients are dialyzed less than 4 hours. I mean, if you go to Australia, 4 hours 3 times a week is the minimum. The usual is more like 4.5, 5 hours 3 times a week if you're not at home. So I think that, but of course, American healthcare, we won't talk about this, but American healthcare has its problems generally.
They certainly have not diminished the costs of dialysis from whatever they've done. And yet home dialysis should be more profitable.
Well, it is.
Yes, right. And even if it's done 4 times a week, it probably still has lower costs.
Yeah, Bob Lockridge and I thought that the cost was somewhere, you could get enough money to pay for somewhere between 4 and 5 dialyses a week, you're saying.
And so why has that not grown faster? Is it a problem with technology? Is the technology too complicated?
No, I don't think it's that. I think the problem is that a general problem in the US is that most of the university training programs for nephrologists, while they may see lots of dialysis in sick patients in the hospital, they don't see what's happening in outside dialysis units, or particularly in home dialysis. And it's only a handful of programs that do any of this, and the boards for nephrology have very little about dialysis in them. So I think it's educational as well as financial greed and things like that.
And what do you think of peritoneal dialysis?
I think it's a very good treatment as an initial treatment. Initial treatment. I mean, I think the experience is that most peritoneal dialysis patients, their peritoneum starts to fail after 2-3 years. I mean, some go on much longer. But in many ways, I believe that what we should be doing is catching patients long before they need dialysis, 6 months or more before they need dialysis, and educating them. When they get to the point of needing dialysis, I think, again, our patients have to have their own options, but I think the ideal is to put them on peritoneal dialysis. They can be trained in a week, and as one of the early CAPD patients said to me, the only problem with it, he said, is I'm a businessman and I travel around locally every day. And he said, I have to start thinking at 9 o'clock in the morning, where am I going to do my 1 o'clock exchange? He said that's the only problem he could see. But I think it's a good initial treatment, and if the patient's willing to do it and educated. And I believe that consideration should be given to putting a fistula into their arm once they're safely well established on peritoneal dialysis, so that when it starts to fail, they can be transferred quickly. There's no point in waiting till it's become absolutely impossible to do peritoneal dialysis. There's a point to change.
Certainly when the patients lose residual kidney function, it gets a lot harder to support them with peritoneal. And the Tankoff catheter, of course, came from the Seattle area too.
Well, actually, peritoneal dialysis in many ways, because Fred Bourne from Holland wrote his thesis on peritoneal dialysis in 1958, and Scribb read it. We'd actually tried peritoneal dialysis in England, but again, the same problem. With a busy acute program, we couldn't have peritoneal patients around. Anyway, Scribb read Fred's thesis and invited Fred to come in 1961 to Seattle. Fred developed a machine for doing peritoneal dialysis using 40-litre carboys of dialysis, and sent his first patient home using this system, I think in late 1963, or maybe 1964. And at that point, Dr. Tankoff, Henry Tankoff, had joined Fred, and the first patient they had at home lived in a suburb probably about a mile away from the university hospital. So one or other of them would go up and stick a catheter in her belly, and then she'd do the dialysis and pull out the catheter herself. And next dialysis, they were dialyzing 3 or 4 times a week. Next dialysis, Henry or Fred would go up and stick a catheter in. And so that's one of the things that led to Henry developing the takeoff catheter. And Henry actually, you know, it has these Dacron cuffs that hold it in place. Henry actually implanted Dacron, not cuffs and catheters, but Dacron into his own abdominal wall to prove that tissue actually grew into the Dacron cuff.
It's a man who's involved in his work.
That's right. And in fact, Fred and Henry developed a machine which the Cope company made for us, which was like a big pressure cooker to prepare the dialysate. And then a company in Seattle, Physio Control, which is basically a heart technology type company, who Scribb and I knew their president. They came up with a home peritoneal dialysis machine which used ultraviolet light and things like that to sterilize the dialysate, and which went very well. And we had we probably had 20 or 30 patients on that.
Yeah, I used it myself.
When
as well.
CAPD was developed. And of course then no machines were needed for a while until Baxter got going with that.
Well, thinking of the PD area, and thinking of the Physio Control machine, and Drake Willick had one as well.
That's right, that's right.
It worked as a proportioning. They were beautifully simple and had a very low infection rate.
Yeah.
Why don't we have that sort of thing available for PD? Why are we shipping 20 liters a day for people on cyclers and things like that?
I don't know.
You know, you are right that you have to know where the market would be, but we're talking about home dialysis.
Well, and as you know, I mean, home dialysis, the time Medicare came in, was about 35% of the patients. There were about 10,000 patients. About 35% of them were on home hemodialysis, and it gradually declined over the next few years. And by 2002, it was down to, I think, 0.5 or 0.6% of the total population. And it started to grow again, I think, thanks to
Slowly.
Axis and now particularly Next Stage. But everybody needs educating: patients, doctors, nurses.
There's a very high fistula rate in Seattle as well. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it's correct. I don't think it's as high as it was. And one reason is, for many years, we had 3 vascular access surgeons who were partners who did all our vascular access surgery. And of course, one of them's died and the other 2 have retired. And then, before you know it, every nephrologist in the community has a friend who's a vascular surgeon who's doing the fistula. So that's one of the problems, I think.
What did you think of the idea of a fistula when you first learned about it?
I thought it was very clever. So, I mean, Scribb was upset that he hadn't thought of it. Very clever indeed. And Scribb and Cimino didn't meet for quite a number of years, but it's a Renal Physicians Association meeting. They both talked and met, and somewhere I should have a recording of the 2 of them talking about it all.
Yes, it definitely was clever.
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
And you know that he'd been, as a medical student, he'd been working at the blood bank. Did you know that?
Well, no.
No, he'd been working at the blood bank, and he'd been sticking big needles in vessels, and I think that had something to do with it.
Yes. You have been a long-term supporter of ASIO and president in the past. And in terms of innovations, like we've been discussing, what's the role of ASIO?
Well, it's more difficult now because there are so many other societies that dialysis and related subjects are discussed at. So I think it's unfortunate that it's declined probably over the last 15, 20 years to SIO, because I think that many very good ideas, in those early days, many very good ideas were developed at the SIO meetings. I don't know now whether it's worth, whether this is the death knell for dialysis in the ASIO.
Well, this year's program looks encouraging, though, would you say?
Sorry?
This year's program looks pretty
I
encouraging.
thought there were some interesting things there, yes.
Very well done.
Yeah.
But you're right, it's become a more minority
Very much a minority.
portion of the presentations.
And after all, it was one of the two big things in the 50s and 60s.
Right. But if a physician or a scientist has a new idea in dialysis, would you think it fits better at SIO or ASN?
Probably at the ASN, we get a much more international audience. But if somebody wants to send it to the SIO, that's fine. You see, I think that's the trouble. They now tend to send it to local societies in different countries, or they send it to the ASN, they send it to the annual dialysis conference and so on. There are many options.
Yeah.
So
Probably get a lot more feedback at SIO if you didn't give it.
Oh, you're right. You're right.
Right. You've published over almost 350.
Yeah, but most of them are repeats of the same thing with variations.
Well, that's being modest. But what's the value in publication to you? Why write the papers?
Well, I think that if you've done something, or you have an idea that you think is potentially useful to others, then publication's the way to get it out. Now, whether 10 years from now there'll be any journals or whether it'll all be on the web is another question. Because, for example, I think some journals now, as for example, Hemodialysis International has just decided that all case reports they'll be listed in the journal, but they'll be on the web unless the editor-in-chief says that this is a particularly special one that should be in print. And I think that that tendency to use the web is spreading much faster than I think people with it.
As an author, do you still feel something special about seeing it in the paper edition?
Well, I don't know about as an author, but I feel that way because I like to read the paper edition.
Yeah.
And then you see, I'm old and set in my ways.
Yeah, that'll be also. You've been a professor at major teaching institutions, and have you felt that the institution itself supports the new technology, new direction, and new therapies like home dialysis?
Well, just based on my experience, see, I've been in two very good places. Leeds was a very good medical school, and University of Washington was a very good medical school. And I think that, and I'm sure that Downstate Medical Center, and there are places where I think are very supportive of technology and new ideas and DNA work and all sorts of things.
That adds a lot to your own zeal to do something.
That's right.
If you have the approval of the department.
Well, I think that this was one thing that Scribb was very good at. He would encourage people to write, and if you notice, most of the time, papers that came out of Seattle, Scribner was the last name on them. I mean, there are some institutions where Scribner would have been the first name on everything.
What do you see as the big challenges for ESRD, looking ahead, say, 20 years?
Clinically, I think the challenge is what you do about the elderly and the other patients who are not going to do well on dialysis, and how do you manage palliative care and so on. That's not to say that you can't have very elderly patients who do very well, but the RPA showed about 5 years ago something like 10 to 15% of patients don't complete their first year on dialysis, either because they stop or because they are stopped. And it's expensive, and the way that our healthcare costs are continuing to go up in this country, I wouldn't be surprised if someday somebody says, well, we can't treat all those dialysis transplant patients unless there's some changes of some sort.
And is that likely to come by some governmentally worked out algorithm, or is it more likely to come from just continuing to decrease resource payment?
I think probably both. I don't know. I mean, it's obviously, you know, you've read about the hepatitis C drug, for example, that costs tens and tens of thousands of dollars to treat somebody with hepatitis C. Very successful drug. I mean, that all the other cancer drugs, somehow, somewhere, something's got to be done to change the system. My personal view is that if Obama, rather than develop what he did, had somehow managed to get a single payer system through, could have been an insurance company, but just one payer rather than, I don't think competition has done much to reduce costs in dialysis.
No, certainly a complicated system is not very efficient. If a machine was simple enough to for patients to understand with a few knobs, what % of people do you think could do home dialysis?
The last time I was at a meeting, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, when we were talking about the Access machine, there were a number of nephrologists there, and we sort of went round the room and talked about this question. And I think the general conception was that maybe 15 or maybe even as many as 20% of patients could do it, appropriately educated, appropriate machines and so on. Whether we'll ever get to that point. I mean, even New Zealand, which has the highest population of home dialysis, is about 18%. So I think that's about the maximum.
What recommendations would you give to a young physician, maybe a house physician, who has an interest in dialysis or treatment of end-stage kidney disease?
It depends on what his interests are. If he's interested in research, I think there are lots of exciting other things going on in nephrology these days. And if he's interested in that sort of thing, that would be great fun. Dialysis isn't all that interesting, you know that. I mean, I don't know what I would have done if Medicare hadn't come in and I hadn't been made the medical director of the kidney centre, because, you know, I had the opportunity to do a lot of political things, and I mean, dialysis is boring. Nurses do it. So I don't know. I mean, I think they should see. I mean, I think all people in training ought to see dialysis and see all aspects of dialysis. But I don't know beyond that. I'd push them. I mean, like my life, so to speak, I think that what happens to medical students when they qualify is that certain extraneous things might make them think about this or that or the other, and it's, I don't know that you can persuade them that that's what they should be doing, unless they want to make money.
In the field of nephrology, would you say that that would be your choice if you could do it all again?
Probably not now. I mean, at the time, I mean, really, if you like, late 50s through sort of 70s at least. I mean, it was a growing, changing, exciting area. Now it's become a sort of a huge treatment program that is there and may never go away.
Right.
Unless, you know, what about if somebody could actually develop well, first of all, what about xenotransplantation? Will that ever work? If that would work, that would be wonderful. I mean, because we all agree transplantation is the best treatment.
Sure.
What about developing kidneys from cells and perhaps having kidneys that you can implant that are made in the laboratory? I mean, there are things like that can help and make a big difference.
Exactly, and there's presentations at SIO about
That's right.
that for sure. Plus the concept of a wearable artificial kidney, either hemo or peritoneal, is certainly here.
That's right. That's right. I like Marty Roberts' thing. I think because my biggest concern about wearable artificial kidneys is blood access. I mean, the literature in terms of home dialysis now, I mean, some of it says that there's more blood access problems with more frequent dialysis. Other literature says that there isn't. But I would certainly worry if everybody was running around with blood access. I don't have, but that should be solvable too, I assume.
I agree. So you
would probably be presented to the ASIO.
hopefully next year.
Yeah.
You've seen 4 generations of blood access, from the Scribner shunt to the fistula to the graft, and then the double lumen catheters. But since that latter one, it's been over 20 years.
Yeah. No,
since the last innovation.
No, I think that it's not a very glamorous subject. I think blood access. I mean,
Well, it's
I mean, it's very
a remarkably difficult area without much glamour. That's for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If you had your career to do over again, what would you do? Anything different, or your life?
Well, at the time it was right. I mean, I think I've had a wonderful career. I don't know what I would do now. I suppose I might well, because I was academic originally. I might enter some other field or some other part of nephrology.
Go back to thyroid treatments?
Probably not now.
With the radioactive iodine. So, and you've certainly had a very supporting and loving family. Has that been a challenge with all of the other things you've done?
Well, yes. I mean, I think my wife's been very long-suffering. Though now that our children have grown up, I mean, she can come with me to meetings, and she does most of the time. And she would have been here if she hadn't had this problem.
Yeah.
She'd come here.
Wonderful.
But my children, I don't know. My younger son, I wish I could remember, my younger son once made a comment about, oh, I know. And my wife was driving a number of kids to school, and they were all talking about, my dad's, this important lawyer, or my dad's this, that, and the other. And Simon, my youngest son, remained silent. And then when they finished, he said, my dad takes kidneys out of dead people and puts them in live people to make them live.
Well, that's great. Well, it's hard to beat that, really, when you think about it. And the whole field of transplantation is certainly still somewhat miraculous, even though
and I
more standardized.
like these arrangements where you can't give your related donor transplant because it doesn't match, and then you have these whole series of people who get a transplant that way.
Yeah, the trade.
Yes.
Yeah, the great trade. Wonderful. Well, you certainly have a uniquely positioned and accurate assessment of a whole bunch of things in the history. You're right, it was an exciting time and a long journey. So thank you very much for the interview. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for putting up with me.